For decades, the Arctic barely made headlines. It wasn't because it lacked value, but because power there was already understood. No countdowns, no crisis meetings, no public threats. Then suddenly, the United States stopped treating Greenland like an ally's territory and started talking about it like something that could be taken. What followed wasn't a war. It wasn't even a confrontation. It was something far more damaging. America's allies stopped assuming U.S. leadership was automatic, and one country known for caution made a choice that quietly rewired Arctic power. Canada chose Denmark. And once that happened, the Arctic changed. For most of modern history, Arctic geopolitics ran on an unwritten agreement. The United States led, everyone else adjusted. Canada coordinated closely with Washington. Denmark managed Greenland while hosting American bases. Nordic countries aligned their security planning with U.S. strategy. Russia was the threat. China was the future concern. The Arctic was the chessboard. Greenland sat at the center of this system. Formally Danish, increasingly autonomous, strategically indispensable. The U.S. military presence there was accepted, not debated. No one questioned borders, no one tested sovereignty. The system worked because no one tried to rewrite it, until that assumption broke. Talk of buying Greenland had been floated before and dismissed just as quickly. But in Trump's second term, the tone changed. Greenland stopped being discussed as an ally's territory and started being framed as a strategic necessity the United States could not afford to leave untouched. Reports began circulating about a special envoy tasked with making Greenland American. Then came the line that mattered most. Military force was no longer ruled out. That single statement did more damage than any deployment ever could, because once force is mentioned against allied territory, the issue is no longer strategy. It's trust. Officially, the justification sounded familiar. National security, Russian Arctic activity, Chinese interest in minerals, protection of NATO's northern flank, but the implication was new and dangerous. If territory is valuable enough, sovereignty becomes negotiable, and if you're powerful enough, allies are expected to accept that. Denmark didn't hear security concerns, it heard a warning. Canada heard something worse, a precedent. If Greenland could be pressured, so could anyone else. And Canada decided not to wait and see how far it would go. Historically, Canadian leaders avoid public confrontation with Washington. They hedge, they soften language, they keep doors open. This time, none of that happened. Canada issued a clear public rejection of American claims. Greenland's future would be decided only by Denmark and Greenland. Not by threats, not by force, not by anyone treating borders as negotiable. There was no ambiguity. Canada wasn't just disagreeing, it was choosing a side. And then it backed that choice with action. Words fade, infrastructure doesn't. Canada announced it would open a permanent consulate in Nuuk, Greenland's capital. This wasn't ceremonial diplomacy. It wasn't routine outreach. It was a physical commitment placed directly inside the dispute. A Canadian diplomatic presence on Greenlandic soil established while Washington was discussing annexation. That move sent three messages at once. Canada recognizes Danish sovereignty. Canada respects Greenlandic agency. Canada is no longer deferring to U.S. leadership in Arctic diplomacy, and then came the most calculated decision of all. Canada didn't send a junior diplomat. It sent its governor-general. That mattered more than most people realized. Greenland's population is overwhelmingly Inuit, so is Canada's governor-general. That transformed the issue overnight. This was no longer just about borders. It became about indigenous self-determination. The implication was unmistakable. Any forced annexation wouldn't just violate Denmark's sovereignty, it would override the will of an indigenous population. Canada was quietly signaling that it would not support that outcome. Greenland noticed, and so did Europe. While Washington assumed European allies would stay cautious, coordination was already underway. One by one, European governments issued statements defending Greenland's status. The language was unusually direct. Greenland belongs to its people. Its future is for Denmark and Greenland alone to decide. There was no balancing act, no attempt to soften the message. Then something extraordinary happened. Multiple NATO allies openly rejected an American territorial demand against another NATO member. That had no precedent. And once it happened, American leadership in the Arctic stopped being automatic. There was no announcement, no formal exclusion. Coordination simply shifted. Canada and Denmark deepened Arctic cooperation with European partners. Nordic countries aligned more closely with each other. Planning began happening without Washington at the center. The United States wasn't expelled, it was worked around, and that distinction matters because exclusion by force creates resistance. Exclusion by choice creates alternatives. And once alternatives exist, power begins to drift. Trump wanted Greenland. What he triggered was something larger, a fracture in trust, a rethinking of alliances, and a new Arctic reality where American leadership is optional, not assumed, and this was only the opening phase. Because once allies learn they can coordinate without you, they don't forget how. From the outside, nothing looked dramatic. No emergency NATO meeting, no sanctions, no public rupture. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Countries that once waited for Washington to lead had stopped waiting. They didn't announce a break. They simply began coordinating directly with each other, quietly, deliberately, and without asking for approval. This is how power actually moves in the modern world, not through declarations but through behavior. And the Arctic was becoming the test case. For years, Nordic countries were treated as supporting players in Arctic security. Competent, capable, but secondary, that perception was outdated. Norway had decades of Arctic military experience. Finland and Sweden had just joined NATO with hardened forces and deep regional knowledge. Iceland controlled critical North Atlantic positioning without needing a standing army. And Denmark, through Greenland, sat on the single most strategic piece of Arctic geography. Add Canada to that mix and something changed. This wasn't a loose group of allies. It was a geographically complete Arctic system. Look at the map long enough and the pattern becomes obvious. Greenland controls North Atlantic access. Iceland sits astride key shipping lanes. Norway monitors the Barents Sea. Canada controls the Northwest Passage and Arctic approaches to North America. Finland and Sweden lock down Northern Europe. Together, these countries don't just participate in Arctic security, they dominate it. And none of that dominance requires American permission. That's the part Washington underestimated. For decades, U.S. leadership was conflated with necessity. The assumption was simple: without America, coordination collapses. But leadership only works when it's trusted. Once trust erodes, dependence turns into vulnerability. And Trump's Greenland rhetoric introduced exactly that fear. If the United States could threaten allied territory today, what would stop it tomorrow? That question alone was enough to change planning assumptions across Europe. No country announced it was excluding the U.S. that would have been confrontational. Instead, coordination began happening elsewhere. Bilateral meetings increased. Joint planning sessions multiplied. Information sharing became more selective. Exercises didn't stop including the U.S., but they stopped depending on it. That distinction is subtle but decisive. Once planning no longer requires you, your leverage disappears. Canada was uniquely positioned. It wasn't anti-American, it wasn't European, it wasn't neutral, it was credible to all sides. Canada shared deep intelligence ties with the U.S., strong institutional trust with Europe, and cultural legitimacy with Arctic indigenous communities. That made Canada the perfect bridge. And bridges don't just connect, they redirect traffic. This part received almost no media attention, but it mattered enormously. Arctic indigenous communities don't view borders the same way states do. Their networks cross national lines. Their identity predates modern borders, and their political legitimacy carries growing weight. By elevating indigenous self-determination, Canada reframed Arctic politics around people, not power blocks. That made unilateral annexation morally radioactive. And it forced European allies to see the issue differently. This wasn't just a territorial dispute anymore. It was a legitimacy test.